Okay, welcome everybody to our fifth lecture in this cognitive psychology lecture series, and today we will speak about long-term memory and learning. And in the first part I would actually like to start not directly with long-term memory, but with the question of how we get information from short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Just a quick recap. We have seen already that memory consists of multiple stores. So we have seen these brief sensory stores, which are just for a couple of 100 milliseconds, like buffer stores, which are specific for each modality, like audition, vision, and so forth. Then last week we have covered in detail short-term memory, or short STM, which can hold a limited amount of information in an active state so that we can work with that information for a short period of time, usually just a couple of seconds or half a minute or so. And today we will talk about long-term memory, or in brief LTM. And the idea of long-term memory is that it can hold information over very long periods of time. So technically for your whole lifetime, if it's relevant information and you need it again or something like that. It's assumed to have basically an unlimited capacity. I mean, in reality, there will be a capacity limit naturally, but in everyday life, we usually don't experience that limit. If we really set our mind to learn something, then we can learn these things. So, how does information get into long-term memory? And let's have a look at the models we have spoken about last week. And we had the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, which was this multi-store model, where we have stimulus input coming in here in the sensory registers, these brief buffers, where also an early selection filter might work, and then some information gets into the short-term store, which is kind of the central workspace in this model. And control processes here then would coordinate which information gets into long-term store or can be retrieved from long-term store into short-term store. So in this model, any information which wants to get into long-term store needs to pass through the short-term store. So we have to become aware of it, and it has to be an STM. Then we have seen the model of Nelson-Cohen, a unitary store model, and here the idea was that short-term memory is not a dedicated, separate store, but instead that short-term memory is the active portion of long-term memory. And therefore any new information is directly encoded into long-term memory. And if it's not relevant, it fades away very quickly and, so to speak, is removed from long-term memory again. And if we keep it in short-term memory long enough and work with that information, then it may become part of long-term memory. And the current view is both, and I think in biological psychology and the other lecture you will get into some detail with that, with patient studies as well. And the idea is that basically information usually passes through short-term memory to get into the long-term memory, but there are circumstances where it has been shown that it also can bypass short-term memory. Okay, I would like to do a little demonstration. Usually I did it in class, naturally, but now I still would like to do it online. You need something to write again, like for the short-term memory task, it will be a memory test. And we will just have a look at the results later and not share the results of all people who do that now. Okay, so I will show you 15 animal names for a certain amount of time. I will set my stopwatch so that, because you will do a second one, so that this is then the same thing. And I would like you to really apply a certain strategy to remember that. So you will see them for a minute or so, and then I will ask you to recall them. And 15 names is quite challenging, and in this instance I would like you to use basically rote rehearsal. So just, like what would we say, animal names, I don't know, something like dog, cat, dog, cat, dog, cat, dog, cat. Just repeat it over and over again as the strategy. Often this is the prime strategy if you want to learn vocabulary of a new language or something like that, if you really have something where you want to do this rote rehearsal. Okay, then please get ready and try to memorize these names of animals just by using rote rehearsal. Okay, ready, set, and go. Another 15 seconds to go. Okay, please stop rehearsing. Now, please write down all animal names you can remember. And since we are online, I suggest you just pause the video and continue once you have written down all names. Don't overdo it, just take a minute or so. Okay, so write down how many you got right. These were the correct words. Again, you can pause the video to compare them in your own pace and write down the number. Okay, now I would like you to remember 15 city names. But this time I would like you to use a different strategy. Namely, not by just rote rehearsal, but instead by working with the information in the widest sense. So this could be, and these are just examples, you are welcome to pick anything you feel more comfortable with. For instance, what do you know about these cities? Try to link it to facts. In which country or continent are the cities? Can you group them by country and continent? You may imagine how they look like, the city, or you imagine its position on a world map or on a map of the country or something like that. So you may try to come up with stories like a travel plan which links these cities. The idea is to get a vivid, rich memory trace, so that you really try to work with the information and not just plainly rehearse the words. So we do the same thing, same time, and ready, set, go. Okay, 15 seconds to go. And please stop rehearsing. And like before, please write down all the city names you can remember. And like before, you can pause the video and then continue once you've written it down and compare and see how many you got right. Again, pause the video if you need to and compare them in your own pace. Okay, so usually I would have students enter on Poll Everywhere how their performance in these two tasks, animals versus cities, compared, but we don't do that here, but you can compare that for yourself. And a trend, what can be seen, is that people remember more cities than animals. Please hold on for your the numbers you've written down, so how many animals and how many cities you have remembered. We may need that at a later point, at a later part. Okay, so how does information get into long-term memory? And with this question, we are talking about the encoding of information. So it's the encoding stage of memory formation. And the standard strategy is, for a lot of people, probably this rehearsal, as we did before in the first practice with the animals, where we just repeat stuff like that. So people investigated whether it's really rehearsal, what can be done here. And Glenberg in the late 1970s did a really nice study. He used a classical short-term memory recall test, as we talked about them in the last week. So participants had to memorize numbers, usually 4 digits, for instance 4913, and briefly after them they had to recall, and they tested the short-term memory. And they rehearsed for this short-term memory task the numbers in their memory, and what they varied across different trials was that the rehearsal was for different durations. 2 seconds or 6 seconds or 18 seconds. So if you get a 4-digit number, for instance 4913, you either had 2 seconds, 4913, 4913, 4913, or 6 seconds. You could do that for 6 seconds, and yet then you were asked in the end. So in total they had 64 trials, so 64 of such numbers and recalls in a single session. At the end of the session, they did something very smart, and that is they did a recall test of all the 64 numbers of that session, and participants did not know about this. What happens now is, because so much time has passed, the short-term memory trace has already decayed and there's nothing left. So any recall which is now done, so any numbers they remember now at the end of the session, they must come from the long-term memory. And the result was that the recall performance of the numbers was totally independent of the amount of rehearsal. So whether you rehearsed a number for 2 seconds or 6 seconds or 18 seconds, it didn't make any difference whether you would remember it later on or not. This is actually strong evidence that it's not rehearsal which is required. So if we just do a plain repetition of the information in short-term memory, this phonological loop and or articulatory loop, then this does not result in transfer to long-term memory. It doesn't have an impact. And I think Alan Badley in one of his books reported about a priest or some religious person who read the same daily prayer for literally decades every evening for dinner to his family. And it's not a horribly long prayer, but when you took the book away from him, he could not recite it. which is just another demonstration that just rehearsing something does not result in encoding of information into long-term memory. What can it be instead? And the alternative idea was proposed by Craig and Lockhart in the early 1970s. And their idea is that it's the amount of processing we do with a stimuli, which then results in long-term memory encoding. So if I process stimuli more, longer, more intensely, the memory trace gets strengthened and it's better encoded. And so the more deeply we process something, the stronger the memory trace is. That's where the name depth of processing theory comes from. And Craig and Lockhart differentiate between two types of rehearsal. First, the maintenance rehearsal, which is really there only to keep information online. Like the example we had before, somebody tells you a number and you just have to keep it online until you find something to write it down. And then the other mode is elaborative rehearsal. And here, this means it's deeper processing. So usually semantic processing of the information. And they claim that only the elaborative rehearsal results in long-term memory storage, but not the maintenance rehearsal. This is important to keep in mind if you want to store and save something in your long-term memory, that you should try to work with the information in an elaborative way and not in a plain maintenance way. Let's have a look at their empirical support for this theory. And in this study, participants actually had to do other tasks and even not a short-term memory task. And in each trial, they saw a word, let's say for example book, and they had to make a judgment about that word. And these judgments differed in the amount of processing which was required to make the judgment. And it could be a judgment about the visual feature. As an example, does the word start with a capital letter? So they probably sometimes had books and words with small letters and sometimes capital letters. And this is a very shallow level of processing. Technically, I don't even need to read the word for that. Then they had questions which revolved around the phonological structure. That means the sound of the word. For instance, does the word rhyme with look? So if you say book, look, yeah, it rhymes. So you say yes. This is an intermediate level of processing. And then they had questions which revolved around the meaning. Participants had to process the meaning, the semantics of the word. For instance, does the word fit into this sentence? I am going to read this. And if it's book, then yes, it fits. And for that, you have to do a semantic thing. So it's, in this experiment, the deepest level of processing they tried. And like in the other study, they did an unexpected recognition task at the end of the session, where they presented participants the words from the task intermingled with words which they haven't seen in any task before, and they looked how well can they remember the words, and do the words from this task, the shallow task, differ the recall performance from this task with the intermediate level of processing from the words of the deep level processing. And that's indeed what they found. Those words with a deep level of processing were recognized best. The intermediate level resulted in an intermediate recall performance, and these were remembered worst. So this is strong evidence for this idea that we need to process information to store it in long-term memory. Okay, so there's an interesting notion here, because the semantic processing resulted in the best recall performance, better than phonological. So this suggests that long-term memory stores verbal information in a semantic fashion. And if you remember last session, then we have seen that short-term memory stores information phonologically. You know, we have this word length effect, how long does it take to say a word, and we had the acoustic confusion, so that M and N and B and P are often confused, even if it's in writing. But in our short-term memory, because it works phonologically, it may be confused. And there's actually also empirical support for this semantic encoding in long-term memory. And participants learned word lists, and with the intention this time really to store it in the long-term memory. So they knew there would be a recall task later on. And they then did a recognition test. So again, the words they learned intermingled with words, the non-targets, they haven't learned. And what Klein did is they manipulated the nature of these non-targets, and they can be completely dissimilar words, and that was easiest to differentiate. It could be words which were phonologically similar to some of the learned words, and if long-term memory works phonologically, that should result in confusion, that some words which sound similar, they say, yes, I've seen that word before. And they had words which were semantically similar to some of the learned words. And if long-term memory works on the semantic level, these semantic similar words should provoke such wrong positive identifications, even if these words are phonologically completely different. And indeed, only the semantically similar words cause confusion in the participants. So again, pointing towards a semantic storage of information in long-term memory. To summarize this section, we've seen that the deeper information is processed, the better it is stored in long-term memory. And the implications are clear. You shouldn't cram in information by mere rehearsal and repetition just before the exam or something, and instead work with the information. And this working can be trying to really properly understand it, and if something is unclear, to research it, think it through really fully and not think, oh yeah, it should be fine, but yeah, what does that actually mean? What's the implication of that? Ask yourself questions about the material. And you may link it explicitly to other knowledge you already have. You may think, I've seen this is a certain mechanism I have to learn here. That's actually somewhat similar to something else I've learned somewhere else. And these things may help you. And you can just try to create a holistic representation of that, a vivid image with it, which goes along with it. Okay, if you have any questions, then please post them in the respective discussion board forum on Blackboard Learn.